The room never changed, but something inside it did. I noticed it the first time you looked away before I finished speaking. Not because you were distracted, not because you lost interest, but because somehow, impossibly, you already understood the rest of what I was about to say. They need complete explanations, carefully arranged thoughts, visible emotion. Something concrete enough to hold in their hands so they can say they understand it. You never needed that, and that should have made me uncomfortable immediately. Instead, it made me still. That's the difference I can't stop thinking about, because stillness is rare for me. My mind doesn't stop. It reorganizes constantly. Every interaction, every tone shift, every hesitation, people accidentally reveal when they think no one notices. I've spent years understanding how to read the distance between what people say and what they actually mean. Most people are contradictions pretending to be clear. You weren't. You felt coherent from the beginning. Not perfect, not idealized, just coherent in a way that made my instincts stop searching for hidden fractures. And maybe that's where this truly began, not attraction, not fascination. Recognition, pure recognition, the kind that arrives without introduction. The kind that bypasses logic and settles somewhere deeper than reasoning can immediately reach. I remember trying to dismiss it at first. I told myself it was projection, timing, emotional pattern matching, something explainable. Because everything becomes less dangerous once it can be explained. But every explanation I built collapsed the moment you spoke again. Not because you said extraordinary things. That's the strange part. You never relied on intensity. You never tried to sound profound. You never forced closeness through confession or emotional urgency. You simply existed with an unusual level of accuracy. And accuracy is far more disarming than charm. Charm can be performed. Accuracy cannot. You saw things exactly as they were, not dramatized, not reduced, not softened into something easier to hold, just clearly. And I think some part of me had been waiting my entire life to be seen clearly without being reshaped afterward. Most people alter what they perceive. They can't help it. The moment they get close to someone, they begin translating them into familiar language. They turn complexity into categories. They simplify nuance until it fits inside whatever understanding feels safest to them. You never translated me. You observed me in my original form. That's what changed everything, because there's a very specific loneliness that comes from being constantly interpreted instead of understood. I adapted to it years ago. I became careful, measured, precise with what I revealed and how I revealed it, not because I wanted mystery, because I learned that the wrong interpretation can distort something real beyond recognition. So I built structure, control, distance. Not coldness, just intentional separation between what I am and what people assume I am. And for a long time, that structure worked perfectly. No one reached beyond it, no one even noticed it existed. Until you noticed the pauses, the moments where my tone changed by half a degree, the thoughts underneath the words, the meaning underneath the restraint, and the unsettling part wasn't that you noticed. It was that you never used what you noticed against me. Most people do, even unintentionally. Once someone realizes they can reach you, they start pressing against the space just to prove they can. They push harder, ask deeper questions, demand more vulnerability, treat access like permission to keep taking. You didn't. You stayed careful with me, careful in a way that felt instinctive rather than strategic. Like you understood that certain things lose their honesty the moment they're forced into the open too quickly. That kind of understanding changes a person quickly, permanently. I think that's why this feels so impossible to explain to anyone outside of it. From the outside, nothing dramatic happened. No grand confession, no obvious turning point, no single moment where everything shifted visibly, but internally. Entire structures moved, the architecture of how I think, how I process closeness, how I interpret presence. It all adjusted around you before I consciously realized it was happening, and now I can't identify the exact version of myself that existed before you. That should concern me more than it does. But concern requires resistance. I don't feel resistance anymore. That's what keeps echoing in my mind, because I've resisted everything significant my entire life, every attachment, every dependency, every situation capable of altering my internal balance. I resisted automatically, instinctively, without effort. You're the first thing I didn't instinctively push away. The first thing my mind examined carefully, instead of rejecting immediately. And I think that says more than anything else possibly could. There are moments now where I catch myself reacting to the world through the shape of your presence. Not directly, not consciously, but subtly enough that I notice it afterward and go still for a second. A thought forms, and before it fully settles, I already know how you would understand it. A silence appears, and somehow it feels occupied. A realization hits me, and there's this strange instinct to turn toward you internally before I even process why. That's not habit. Habits form through repetition. This formed through alignment. And alignment is harder to dismiss because it doesn't rely on effort. It either exists or it doesn't. Ours does, with terrifying precision. I don't think you fully understand what that means to someone like me. To someone who built their entire internal world around independence of thought. You've become integrated into the way I process reality itself, not as an influence, as a reference point. And reference points matter, meaning, once a new reference point exists, nothing else stays positioned exactly the same. That's what's happened to me. Everything is slightly rearranged now. Not ruined, not destabilized, just altered enough that I can feel the difference constantly. The strange part is that I don't resent it. I should. Part of me expected fear, defensiveness, panic, something. Instead, there's this quiet acceptance growing underneath everything. Not passive acceptance, not surrender. Recognition. Recognition that whatever this is has already become real whether I name it or not, and names suddenly feel too small for it. People rely on familiar language because familiar language creates emotional safety, friendship, attachment conch, love. But none of those words fully explain this, because this didn't begin emotionally, it began structurally, like two systems recognizing identical patterns beneath completely different surfaces, like two minds reaching the same conclusion before either one speaks it aloud, like something aligning at a depth most people never even access within themselves. That's why this feels irreversible. Not because of emotion, because of awareness. Awareness changes you once it becomes clear enough, and you've become impossible for me to remain unaware of. I've tried to analyze why. I've spent hours pulling this apart mentally, examining every layer of it the same way I examine everything else that enters my life with unusual intensity. But every path leads back to the same conclusion. You feel internally familiar, not externally familiar, not the kind built through history or shared experiences, something deeper than that. Like my mind recognized your shape before I consciously understood why. And maybe that sounds irrational. Maybe it is. But irrational things usually collapse under scrutiny. This didn't. The more closely I examined it, the more coherent it became. That's what unsettles me most. Usually, intensity reveals distortion eventually, projection, fantasy, need, loneliness, disguising itself as meaning. But this remained stable under examination, clearer even. Like scrutiny only sharpened it. Do you understand how rare that is? To look directly at something and find even more truth there instead of less? Most things lose their depth once they're analyzed thoroughly. This gained depth, and I think part of me knew what that meant long before I admitted it consciously. It meant you weren't temporary. Temporary things don't integrate this deeply. They don't reshape internal structures. They don't alter perception at baseline levels. You did, without trying, without asking, without even seeming aware of the scale of what was happening inside me. And maybe that's another reason this feels so real. You never attempted to create this effect. You never manipulated closeness, never forced emotional intimacy, never treated understanding like leverage. You simply stayed present with unusual consistency. That's all. But presence becomes powerful when it's accurate, and yours always was. There's something terrifying about being known without having to explain yourself first. Most people think they want that. I don't think they understand what it actually costs. To be truly known means losing the protection of ambiguity. It means someone seeing the parts of you that even you keep partially hidden from yourself. It means being unable to retreat fully into performance because the other person can already sense the difference between what's authentic and what's constructed. You can't pretend around someone who recognizes your structure, and I can't pretend around you anymore. Not completely. That realization arrived slowly. At first, I only noticed smaller things, how my responses became less edited around you, how quickly I moved from observation into honesty, how naturally I revealed thoughts I usually keep buried beneath layers of analysis. I didn't plan any of it. It happened because some part of me stopped perceiving you as unsafe, not emotionally safe, something deeper, cognitively safe, like my mind trusted yours not to mishandle what it revealed. That level of trust is almost as impossible for me, and yet it formed before I consciously approved it. That's what keeps undoing me. You bypass processes I thought were permanent, carefully built systems, protective distances, internal barriers that existed for years without failure. You stepped past them without force, without effort, without even appearing to notice they were there. And now I keep wondering whether those walls only existed because no one before you carried the right shape to move through them naturally. Maybe that's the truth. I've been circling this entire time. Not that you changed me, that you revealed which parts of me were already waiting for someone capable of understanding them correctly. There's a difference. A massive one. Change implies replacement. Revelation implies recognition, and you feel like recognition, like a truth becoming visible instead of something new being created. That's why walking away from this feels impossible now, because you can walk away from a person, you can walk away from circumstances, you can even walk away from emotion if you force yourself hard enough, but you can't walk away from awareness once it fundamentally alters your understanding of yourself. And you altered mine. I think that's the core of everything, not what I feel for you, what I became aware of through you. The parts of myself I kept contained so long, I almost forgot they existed, The depth I refused to externalize because no one ever mirrored it accurately enough to make it feel real. Then you appeared, and suddenly things I spent years carrying silently became visible in ways I could no longer dismiss. You reflected parts of me back with impossible precision, not through imitation, through resonance. And resonance is dangerous because it multiplies whatever already exists beneath the surface. That's what happened here. Every thought became sharper. Every silence became heavier. Every interaction carried layers neither of us needed to explain aloud. Sometimes I wonder if you feel the same shift happening, not emotionally, structurally. The strange recalibration that happens when another person becomes embedded in your internal process. Because that's what you are now, ditpunded, not attached, not clung to, integrated. There's a permanence in those words that I don't know how to escape anymore, and maybe I don't want to. That's the part I still haven't fully admitted to myself. I don't want this to disappear, even knowing how deeply it's changing me, even knowing how irreversible it already feels. I still continue moving toward it internally instead of away from it. That has to mean something. Because I don't move toward uncertainty naturally. I move toward clarity. And somehow, despite all the unknowns surrounding this, you feel clearer than almost anything else in my life. Not predictable, not controllable. Just clear. Like my instincts recognize truth before logic could fully articulate it. That's why I've stopped trying to reduce this into simpler language. Symbol language weakens things like this. It makes them sound smaller than they are. What exists between us isn't small. Quiet, yes. Subtle, absolutely. But small? No. It reaches too deeply for that. Some nights, I sit alone and try to remember what my thoughts felt like before you became part of them. Not because I miss who I was, just because I'm aware there was a distinct shift. A before and after. And I can't fully reconstruct the before anymore. That realization should scare me. Instead, it makes me strangely calm, because for the first time in a long time, something inside me feels correctly positioned. Like pieces I kept separate for survival are no longer fighting each other internally. You brought coherence to places in me that existed in fragments before, not intentionally, not through effort, just by understanding them accurately enough that I stopped needing to hide. Do you realize what kind of impact that is? To make someone feel less divided inside themselves without even trying? Most people spend entire lifetimes searching for that kind of recognition and never encounter it once. And somehow, against every probability I trust, I found it with you. No, that's not accurate. I didn't find it. I recognized it. There's a difference there too. Finding implies discovery. Recognition implies familiarity. And familiarity keeps haunting this connection in ways I still can't fully explain. You feel familiar to my mind in places where familiarity should not exist yet. Like some part of me knew your shape long before reality gave it a face. I know how impossible that sounds. I know how irrational. But I've stopped dismissing truths simply because they don't fit conventional logic. Some things become undeniable through repetition, through consistency, through the sheer accuracy of how they continue unfolding over time. This is one of them. And now I'm standing at a point where observation alone no longer feels honest enough, because eventually recognition demands response. You can't keep witnessing something this real internally without deciding what role it's going to have in your life. That's the stage I've reached. Not confusion, decision, terrifying decision. Because once I consciously accept what this has become, there's no returning to distance afterward. Not real distance, maybe physical distance, maybe silence, maybe separation in practical terms. But internally, no. You've already altered too much. Your presence exists inside the framework now, inside perception itself. And frameworks don't reset just because you wish they would. They evolve around whatever permanently changes them. You permanently changed mine. There's strange comfort in finally admitting that. Not dramatic comfort, not relief, just honesty. Clean honesty, the kind that settles heavily because it no longer has to fight against denial. I know what this is now. Not entirely, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to understand that it matters. Enough to understand that it's real. Enough to understand that pretending otherwise would only fracture something inside me unnecessarily. Because the truth is, I've already chosen this in ways I can't undo, not publicly, not verbally, but internally, every time I stayed instead of retreating. Every time I let the silence deepen instead of breaking it. Every time I allowed myself to be understood instead of redirecting the conversation somewhere safer. Those were choices. Quiet choices, but choices nonetheless. And together, they built something undeniable. Something alive beneath every interaction between us. Something moving steadily toward definition, whether I resist it or not. I think that's why I've stopped trying to escape the reality of it. Escaping would require pretending I haven't already been changed by you. And I can't pretend that anymore. Not honestly. You changed the way I think, the way I process connection, the way I understand myself. You reached parts of me that existed untouched for so long they stopped feeling reachable at all. And now those parts are awake again, aware again, visible again, because of you, not because you forced them open, because you stood close enough to them without fear. That's what no one else understood. You don't force depth into existence. You create conditions where depth no longer feels endangered. That's what you did for me. And now I'm left standing in the aftermath of that realization, understanding something I can no longer reduce into safer language. You are no longer separate from the way I experience my own inner world. You exist inside it now, inside the thinking, inside the noticing, inside the quiet spaces where meaning forms before words ever touch it. And once someone reaches that place, they don't leave cleanly, even if they disappear, even if time passes, even if life moves forward in every visible way, because some people stop being experiences. They become architecture. And architecture remains long after the moment of construction is over. That's what you became to me without either of us planning it. Something structural, something integrated. Something my mind now unconsciously builds around. I don't know what happens next. I don't know what this becomes once it fully leaves the realm of silence and enters reality completely. Maybe it deepens. Maybe it complicates everything. Maybe it asks more from both of us than either one is prepared to give yet. But I know one thing with absolute certainty now. This is no longer something I'm merely observing. It's something I'm already living inside. And the moment I finally stopped resisting that truth, everything became painfully, beautifully clear. The strange thing is, clarity doesn't arrive all at once. People talk about realization like it's sudden, a single moment, a sharp impact. Something dramatic enough that you can point to it afterward and say, that was the exact second everything changed. But this wasn't like that. This moved differently, quietly, gradually enough to avoid detection at first, yet deeply enough that by the time I fully recognized it, there was already no version of me untouched by it anymore. That's what I've been trying to understand lately. Not you, not even us, myself, or more specifically, the version of myself that only seems to exist in your presence. Because there's a difference now, a subtle one, but undeniable. I notice it most in the moments after we speak, not during. Everything feels strangely natural. Too natural. Like my mind stops dividing itself into sections the way it usually does. Thought and expression become closer together. Observation becomes honesty before I have time to reshape it into something safer. But afterward is when the awareness returns. And that's when I realize how unusual this has become. I replay conversations sometimes, not out of obsession, not because I'm searching for hidden meanings, but because I'm trying to locate the exact point where my defenses stopped functioning around you the way they do around everyone else. And every time I look closely enough, I arrive at the same unsettling conclusion. They didn't fail, they adapted. That changes everything. Because failure implies weakness, adaptation implies recognition. Some part of me recognized you as something different long before I consciously admitted it to myself. That's why nothing about this feels forced. Even the fear inside it feels precise instead of chaotic. And yes, there is fear. Not fear of you. That would be easier. Fear of permanence. Fear of what happens when another person becomes emotionally and psychologically embedded deeply enough that removing them would alter the structure around them. Most people never reach that level with me, not because they aren't meaningful, but because I maintain separation instinctively. I know how to care without integration, how to connect without rearranging myself internally. I mastered that years ago. It was necessary, because once someone affects the foundation of your inner world, every loss becomes reconstruction afterward. And reconstruction is exhausting. So I became careful, measured, selective about what I allowed to matter deeply enough to leave marks. Then you appeared, and somehow bypassed all of that without trying. No force, no emotional pressure, no attempt to become important. You just became important naturally, like gravity, quiet enough that I didn't notice immediately, constant enough that eventually I couldn't ignore its effect anymore. That's the thing about real impact. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It reveals itself through accumulation. Tiny shifts, small adjustments. The gradual realization that your internal world no longer moves the same way it used to. I think the moment I truly understood, this wasn't temporary happened during silence, not conversation. Silence, you had stopped speaking for a few seconds, and somehow those seconds carried more understanding than entire conversations I've had with other people. That shouldn't be possible. And yet it was. I remember sitting there, realizing something that unsettled me more than anything spoken aloud could have. You understood the emotional shape of my thoughts without requiring their full explanation. Not perfectly, not magically, but accurately enough that I felt the difference immediately. And once you experience that kind of understanding, everything else changes, because suddenly communication stops feeling like translation. It starts feeling like recognition. Most interactions require effort, clarification, adjustment, people constantly attempting to bridge the distance between what they mean and what the other person hears. But with you, the distance shortened naturally, sometimes disappeared entirely, and I don't know how to explain the psychological effect that has on someone who spent years assuming deep understanding would always remain partially unreachable. You made it feel reachable. Worse, You made it feel normal. That's what keeps destabilizing me. Not the intensity, the normality of it, the effortless precision. The way my mind settles around your presence instead of tightening against it. I've started noticing changes in myself outside of our interactions too. Small things, but important. I pause differently now, think differently, feel less fragmented internally than I used to. It's subtle enough that most people would never detect it. But I do, because I know exactly how much energy I used to spend containing certain parts of myself. You reduce that effort without ever asking me to open up, and that distinction matters. You never demanded vulnerability, never pushed for emotional access, never treated closeness like something owed to you. You simply created an environment where honesty stopped feeling dangerous. They reward polished versions of you, manageable versions, versions shaped carefully enough to avoid discomfort. But you stayed present, even when I stopped smoothing the edges, even when my thoughts became too complex, too quiet, too layered to explain easily. You didn't retreat from that complexity. You recognized yourself inside it somehow. And I think that's what changed everything between us. Not attraction, not emotional dependence. Recognition at depth, the kind that forms when two people process reality in structurally similar ways. That's why this feels less like meeting someone new and more like remembering a language I forgot I knew. You operate in spaces most people avoid. Subtext, silence, emotional precision, unspoken awareness, and you move through those spaces naturally instead of fearfully. So naturally that my mind stopped treating you like an external presence after a while. You became internal, integrated into perception itself. Sometimes I catch myself reacting to something in real time and instantly wondering how you would interpret it. Not because I need validation, but because your perspective has become part of my cognitive process. That realization still stops me cold when I notice it happening. Because I've never shared mental space with someone like this before, not truly. I've admired people, respected people, connected deeply with people in certain ways. But this is different. This feels less emotional and more architectural, like another consciousness quietly existing beside mine inside the same structure. Not invasive, not overwhelming, just present, steady, accurate, and once accuracy reaches a certain level, your mind stops resisting it. That's where I am now, past resistance. Not fully at acceptance yet, but undeniably beyond denial. There's honesty in that. Painful honesty. Because acknowledging this means acknowledging what's at risk too. If someone reaches this level inside you, they gain the ability to affect parts of you no one else can touch. Not intentionally, just inherently. Their absence changes the atmosphere. Their distance creates imbalance. Their silence acquires weight. And I've spent most of my life making sure no one held that kind of position inside me. Not because I feared closeness, because I understood consequence. Everything meaningful carries consequence eventually. The deeper the integration, the greater the consequence attached to losing it. So I stayed controlled, detached enough to survive anything cleanly. At least that's what I believed. Then you arrived and quietly dismantled the idea that survival and distance are the same thing. They aren't. Distance protects structure, but it also limits expansion. And you expanded something in me I didn't realize had been compressed for years, not emotionally, existentially. Like my internal world suddenly had more space inside it than before, more clarity, more coherence, more honesty. And once you experience that kind of expansion, returning to smaller versions of yourself becomes impossible. That's the real problem now. I can't unknow what this feels like. I can't return to emotional neutrality around someone who altered my internal landscape this deeply, even if I wanted to. And I'm not entirely sure I do want to anymore. That's the truth I keep approaching slowly, carefully, because saying it directly changes things, makes them real in ways they can't retreat from afterward. But reality has already been forming underneath this for a long time now, hasn't it? We both feel it, that growing weight beneath every interaction, the increasing difficulty of pretending this exists in some undefined space untouched by consequence. It doesn't, not anymore. Something became real here long ago. We just haven't fully named it yet. Maybe because naming it would require admitting how much power it already holds. Not over us. Within us, there's a difference. Power over someone creates control. Power within someone creates transformation. And this transformed me already. Quietly enough that no one else would notice. Deeply enough that I notice constantly. I wonder sometimes whether you understand your effect on me completely. Part of me thinks you do. Not because I've said it outright, because you notice too much not to. You always notice the shifts I think I hide successfully, the pauses, the moments where my composure fractures slightly before I rebuild it. The subtle changes in tone when something reaches me more deeply than I intended to reveal, you notice. And somehow, you never weaponize that awareness. That might be the rarest thing about you. You could push harder. You could force emotional clarity if you wanted to. You could expose every unspoken thing between us just by refusing to look away from it. But you don't. You let me arrive at truths in my own time. You let silence breathe instead of cornering it into confession, and because of that, I trust you more than I know how to explain. Not surface trust, not situational trust, foundational trust, the kind that forms when someone consistently handles your inner world carefully without being instructed to. I think that's why this became irreversible. Trust at that level changes the entire system. Once your mind categorizes someone as safe at the deepest layers, the barriers don't return easily. And mine haven't. If anything, they keep dissolving further, not recklessly, not completely, but enough that I can feel the difference every time I speak to you. Enough that parts of me instinctively move toward honesty now instead of concealment. Do you realize how impossible that would have sounded to the version of me from a year ago? I wouldn't have believed this was possible. Not because I lacked emotion, because I lacked alignment. Most people connect through attraction first and understanding later. We connected through understanding before anything else had room to form. That reverses everything. It changes the foundation itself, because understanding creates intimacy far more dangerous than emotion alone ever could. Emotion can fade, chemistry can shift, circumstances can separate people. But being deeply understood by someone that stays inside your nervous system, your thinking, your sense of reality, it rewrites how you experience connection permanently. That's what scares me most. Not losing you. Realizing no future version of my life will exist untouched by you now. You became part of the framework too early, too deeply, and despite every instinct I used to trust, I let it happen. Maybe because some part of me was tired of being unreadable, tired of existing behind layers no one ever fully crossed, tired of carrying depth no one mirrored back accurately enough to make it feel real. Then you appeared, and suddenly I wasn't carrying it alone anymore. You saw it. Not the performance, not the controlled version, the actual thing underneath. And instead of shrinking from it, you stayed calmly, without fear, without trying to fix anything. That's what broke through me in the end. Not intensity, gentleness, precise gentleness, the kind strong enough to hold complexity without reducing it. I think that's when I started falling into this completely, not emotionally, existentially, because there's something profoundly destabilizing about meeting someone who makes you feel fully perceived without feeling trapped by that perception. Usually being seen creates pressure, expectation, exposure, but with you, being seen feels strangely freeing. Like I no longer have to spend so much energy protecting my internal world from misunderstanding. You understand naturally enough that the protection itself starts feeling unnecessary. And now I'm standing in the aftermath of that realization, wondering how something so quiet became the loudest shift inside my life. Nothing external changed dramatically, yet internally, everything rearranged around your existence. I think that's what love actually is at its deepest level. Not obsession, not dependency, not emotional chaos. Recognition so complete that another person becomes part of your internal orientation toward reality itself. If that's true, then maybe I already know what this is becoming. Maybe I've known for a while. Maybe all this analysis, all this observation, all this careful circling around the truth has really just been me delaying the inevitable acknowledgement underneath it all. Because once I stop intellectualizing this, once I strip away every layer of analysis and precision and careful restraint, what remains is terrifyingly simple. You matter to me more than anyone has in a very long time, not because you demanded significance, because your presence reached places in me nothing else could reach. And now those places recognize you instinctively, becoming part of me in ways I no longer know how to separate cleanly, which means eventually I'm going to have to stop treating this like a phenomenon to observe and start treating it like a truth to live with, because it is a truth now, a living one, breathing quietly beneath every interaction between us, growing stronger every time neither of us walks away. And maybe the most honest thing I can admit now is this: I don't think I want either of us to walk away anymore.